Thank you for joining us at the Liberty Mindset. Freedom is a state of being.
Do you have
and liberty
freedom?
is a state of
In
mind.
essence, are you allowed
So
to be
stay
you?
curious
Do
and
you have
seek
the
the truth.
quality or state of being free? The power to do as one pleases, freedom from physical restraint, freedom from arbitrary or despotic control, the power of choice. Are you sovereign? That is the Liberty Mindset. Let us foster our curiosity and seek the truth.
I love the way this application flips everything. Yeah, I'm not going to be doing video broadcasts much, I don't think. I do too much reading, and it's really hard to, and also frustrating to flip back and forth between, I'd have to have everything reversed. I had plans to display the reading today, and lo and behold, you'll be able, I suppose you could work really hard and read it backwards, but I can read backwards, but not everybody can do that. But I'm dyslexic, so it's almost like normal for me. Welcome to Liberty Mindset, everybody. Today is the 15th of February, and this is episode 6. We're going through Planned Cahos by Ludwig von Mises. Von Mises was a Austrian born in America and later emigrated to America in the early 1920s and 30s during the conflict known as World War II. He was a Jewish man, and so he was escaping the Nazi Empire. He is a well-known among libertarians. The Mises Caucus is named after him, and his economic principles that he espouses, and most of what the Austrian school espouses, has been proven time and again to be accurate. Interestingly enough, there are different theories on economics, and Mises describes pure capitalism, and that's what we're reading his book, which is called Planned Cahos, which is what it's about. Chapter 3 is a bit of a stretch of a read. It's a little bit longer than the last one, and I hope that everybody enjoys what I'm doing, and if not, well, then don't listen. So there's that. Also, this will be edited and put into a podcast that will be available on, everywhere. It will be also a video podcast. It'll have the same video as this, so there's no reason to go and watch it differently than if you're catching it here. Which I now realize everything on that podcast is going to be backwards because, that's the way things are. Okay. In the Socialism and Communism is the title of Chapter 3, and let's take a moment and look at what Mr. Mises has to say about those two forms of capitalism. Socialism and communism. In the terminology of Marx and Engels, the words communism and socialism are synonymous. They are alternately applied without any distinction between them. The same was true for the picture of the Marxian groups and sects until 1917. The political parties of Marxism... sorry about that. Move my mic a little bit. The political parties of Marxism, which considered the Communist Manifesto as the unalterable gospel of their doctrine, called themselves socialist parties. The most influential and most numerous of these parties, the German Party, adopted the name Socialist Democratic Party in Italy, in France, and in all the other countries in which Marxist parties already played a role in political life before 1917. The term socialist likewise superseded the term communist. No Marxists ever ventured before 1917 to distinguish themselves between communists and socialism. In 1875, in the criticism of the Gotha Programme of the German Socialist Democratic Party, Marx distinguished between a lower, earlier, and a higher, later phase of the future communist society. But he did not reserve the name of communism to the higher phase and did not call the lower phase socialism as differentiated from the communism. One of the fundamental dogmas of Marx is that socialism is bound to come with, quote, with the inexorability of a law of nature, unquote. Capitalist production begets its own negation and establishes the socialist system of public ownership. Of the means of production. This process, quote, executes itself through the operation of the inherent laws of capitalist production, end quote. It is independent of the wills of the people. It is impossible for men to accelerate it, to delay it, or to hinder it. For, quote, no socialist system ever disappears before all the productivity forces are developed, for the development of which it is broad enough, and new higher methods of production never appeared before the material conditions of the existence have been hatched out of the womb of the previous society, end quote. This doctrine, of course, is irreconcilable with Marx's own political activities and with the teaching he advanced for the justification of these activities. Marx tried to organize a political party which, by means of revolution and civil war, should accomplish the transition from capitalism to socialism. The characteristic features of their parties was, in the eyes of Marx and all Marxian doctrinates, that they were revolutionary parties invariably committed to the idea of violent action. Their aim was to rise in rebellion, to establish the dictatorship of the proletarians, to exterminate mercilessly all the bourgeois, and the deeds of the Paris communards in 1871 were considered as the perfect model for such a civil war. The Paris Revolt, of course, had lamentably failed, but later uprisings were expected to succeed. However, the tactics applied by the Marxian parties in the various European countries were irreconcilably opposed to each of these two contradictory varieties of the teachings of Karl Marx. They did not place confidence in the inevitability of the coming of socialism, neither did they trust in the success of a revolutionary upheaval. They adopted the methods of parliamentarian action. They solicited votes in election campaigns and sent their delegates into the parliaments. They, quote, degenerated, end quote, into democratic parties. In the parliaments, they behaved like other parties of the opposition. In some countries, they entered into temporary alliances with other parties, and occasionally socialist members sat in the cabinets. Later, after the end of the First World War, the socialist parties became paramount in many parliaments. In some countries, they ruled exclusively. In others, in close cooperation with bourgeois parties. 1917 never abandoned lip service to the rigid principles of orthodox Marxism. They repeated again and again that the coming of socialism is unavoidable. They emphasized the inherent revolutionary character of their parties. Nothing could arouse their anger more than when somebody dared to dispute their adamant revolutionary spirit. However, in fact, they were parliamentary parties just like all other parties. From a correct Marxian point of view, as expressed later in the writings of Marx and Engels, but not yet in the Communist Manifesto, all measures designed to restrain, to regulate, and to improve capitalism were simply petty bourgeois nonsense, stemming from an ignorance of the immanent laws of the capitalist evolution. True socialists should not place any obstacle in the way of capitalist evolution, for only the full maturity of capitalism could bring about socialism. It is not only vain, but harmful to the interests of the proletarians to resort to such measures. Even labor unionism is not an adequate means for the improvement of the conditions of the workers. Marx did not believe that interventionism could benefit the masses. He violently rejected the idea that such measures as minimum wage rates, price ceilings, restrictions of interest rates, social security, and so on are parliamentary steps in bringing about socialism. He aimed at the radical abolition of wages of a wage system, which can accomplish only by communism. In its higher phase, he would have sarcastically ridiculed the idea of abolishing the, quote, commodity character, end quote, of labor within the frame of a capitalist society by the enactment of a law. But the socialist parties, as they operated in the European countries, were virtually no less committed to interventionism, than the Sozialpolitik of the Kaiser's Germany and the American New Deal. It was against his policy that George Soros and syndicationalism directed their attacks. Soros, a timid intellectual of a bourgeois background, depreciated the degeneration of the socialist parties, for which he blamed their penetration by bourgeois intellectuals. He wanted to see the spirit of ruthless aggressiveness inherent in the masses revived and freed from the guardianship of intellectual cowards. For Soros, nothing counted but riots. He advocated action directe, i.e., sabotage and the general strike, as intermediary steps toward the final great revolution. Soros had success, mostly among the snobbish and idle intellectuals, and no less snobbish and idle heirs of wealthy entrepreneurs. He did not perceptibly move the masses. For the Marxism Party in the Western and Central Europe, his passionate criticism was hardly more than a nuisance. His historical importance consisted mainly in the role as ideas played in the evolution of Russian Bolshevism and Italian fascism. In order to understand the mentality of the Bolshevists, we must again refer to the dogmas of Karl Marx. Marx was fully convinced that capitalism is a stage of economic history which is not limited to a few advanced countries only. Capitalism has the tendency to convert all parts of the world into capitalist countries. The bourgeoisie forces all nations to become capitalist nations. When the final hour of capitalism sounds, the whole world will uniformly in the stage of mature capitalists ripe for the transition to socialism. Socialism will emerge at the same time in all parts of the world. Marx erred in this point no less than in all the other statements. Today, even the Marxians cannot and do not deny that there still prevail enormous differences in the development of capitalism in various countries. They realize that there are many countries which, from the point of view of the Marxian interpretations of history, must be described as pre-capitalistic. In these countries, the bourgeoisie cannot yet attain ruling position, and has not yet set the historical stage of capitalism, which is the necessary prerequisite of the appearance of socialism. These countries, therefore, must first accomplish their bourgeois revolution and must go through all phases of capitalism before there can be any question of transforming them into socialist countries. The only policy which Marxism could adopt in such countries would be to support the bourgeois unconditionally, first in their endeavors to seize power, and then in their capitalistic ventures. A Marxian party could, for a very long time, have no other task than to be observant to our bourgeois liberalism. This alone is the mission which the historical materialism, if consistently applied, could assign to the Russian Marxians. They would be forced to wait quietly until capitalism could have made their nation ripe for socialism. But the Russian Marxians did not want to wait. They resorted to a new modification of Marxism according to which it was possible for a nation to skip one of the stages of a historical revolution. They had shut their eyes to the very fact that this new doctrine was not modification of Marxism, but rather the denial of the last remnant which was left of it. It was an undisguised return to the pre-Marxian, anti-Marxian socialist teachings according to which men were free to adopt socialism at any time if they considered it as a system more beneficial to the Commonwealth than capitalism. It utterly exploded all the mysticism inwrought into the dialectical materialism and the alleged Marxism discovery of the inexorable laws of mankind and economic growth. Having emancipated themselves from Marxism determinism, the Russian Marxians were free to discuss the most appropriate tactics for the realization of socialism in their country. They were no longer bothered with economic problems. They had no longer to investigate whether or not the time had come. They had only one task to accomplish: the seizure of the reins of government. One group maintained the lasting success would be expected only if the supported sufficient numbers of the people, though not necessarily of the majority, would be won. Another group did not favor such time-consuming procedure. They suggested a bold stroke. A small group of fanatics could be organized as the vanguard of the revolution. Strict discipline and unconditional obedience to the chief should make these professional revolutionaries fit for sudden attack. They would supplement the czarist government and then rule the country according to the traditional methods of the czar's police. The term used to signify these two groups, Bolshevists, majority, or the latter, and Menshevists, minority, for the former, refer to the vote taken in 1903 at a meeting held for the discussion of these tactical issues. The only difference dividing the two groups from one another was this matter of tactical methods. They both agreed with regard to the ultimate end, socialism. Both sects tried to justify their respective points of view by quoting passages from Marx and Engels' writings. This is, of course, the Marxian custom, and each sect was in position to discover in their sacred books dicta confirming its own stand. Lenin, the Bolshevist chief, knew his countrymen much better than his adversaries and their leader, Plekhanov, did. He did not, like Plekhanov, make the mistake of applying to Russians the standards of the Western nations. He remembered how foreign women had twice simply usurped supreme power and quietly ruled for a lifetime. He was aware of the fact that the terrorist method of the czarist secret police were successful, and he was confident that he could considerably improve on these methods. He was a ruthless dictator, and he knew that the Russians lacked the courage to resist oppression. Like Cromwell, Robespierre, and Napoleon, he was an ambitious usurper and fully trusted the absence of revolutionary spirit in the immense majority. The autocracy of the Romanovs was doomed because the unfortunate Nicholas II was a weakling. The socialist lawyer Kerensky failed because he was committed to the principle of parliamentary government. Lenin succeeded because he never aimed at anything else than his own dictatorship, and the Russian yearned for a dictator, for a successor of the terrible Ivan. The rule of Nicholas II was not ended by a real revolutionary upheaval. It collapsed on the battlefields. Anarchy resulted, which Kerensky could not master. A skirmish in the streets of St. Petersburg removed Kerensky. A short time later, Lenin had his 18th Brumaire. In spite of all the terror practiced by the Bolsheviks, the Constituent Assembly, elected by universal franchise for men and women, had only about 20% Bolshevik members. Lenin dispelled by force of arms the Constituent Assembly, and the short-lived liberal interlude was liquidated. Russia passed from the hands of the inept Romanovs into those of a real autocrat. Lenin did not content himself with the conquest of Russia. He was fully convinced that he was destined to bring the bliss of socialism to all nations, not only to Russia. The official name which he chose for his government, Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, does not contain any reference to Russia. It was designed as the nucleus of a world government. It was implied that all foreign comrades by rights owed allegiance to this government, and that all foreign bourgeois who dared to resist their guilty of high treason and deserved capital punishment. Lenin did not doubt in the least that all Western countries were on the eve of the great final revolution. He daily expected its outbreak. There was, in the opinion of Lenin, only groups in Europe that might, although without any prospect of success, try to prevent the revolutionary upheaval. The depraved members of the intelligentsia who had usurped the leadership of the socialist parties. Lenin had long hated these men for their addiction to parliamentary procedure and their reluctance to endorse his dictatorial aspirations. He raged against them because he held them responsible for the fact that the socialist parties had supported the war effort of their countries. Already in his Swiss exile, which ended in 1917, Lenin began to split the European socialist parties. Now he set up a third international, which he controlled in the same dictatorial manner in which he directed the Russian Bolsheviks. For this new party, Lenin chose the name Communist Party. The Communists were the fight into the death the various European socialist parties, these social traitors, and they were arranged in the immediate liquidation of the bourgeois and seizure of power by the armed workers. Lenin did not differentiate between socialism and communism as social systems. The goal, which he aimed at, was not called communism as opposed to socialism. The official name of the Soviet government is Union of Socialist, not of the Communist Soviet Republics. In this regard, he did not want to alter the traditional terminology, which considered the terms as synonymous. He merely called his partisans the only sincere and consistent supporters of the revolutionary principles of orthodox Marxism, communists and their tactical methods, communism, because he wanted to distinguish them from the treacherous hirelings of the capitalist exploiters, the wicked social democratic leaders like Kautsky and Albert Thomas. These traitors, he emphasized, were anxious to preserve the capitalism. They were not true socialists. The only genuine Marxians were those who rejected the name of socialist, irremediably fallen into disrepute. Thus, the distinction between communism and socialism came into being. Those Marxians who did not surrender to the dictator in Moscow called themselves social democrats, or, in short, socialists. What characterized them was the belief that most appropriate method for the realization of their plan to establish socialism, the final goal common to them as well as to the communists, was to win the support of the majority of their fellow citizens. They abandoned the revolutionary slogans and tried to adopt democratic methods for the seizure of power. They did not bother about with problems whether or not the socialist regime is compatible with democracy, but for the attainment of socialism, they were resolved to apply democratic procedures. The communists, on the other hand, were in the early years of the Third International firmly committed to the principles of revolution and civil war. They were loyal only to their Russian chief. They expelled from their ranks everybody who was suspected of feeling himself bound by any of his country's laws. They plotted unceasingly and squandered blood in unsuccessful riots. Lenin could not understand why the communists failed everywhere outside of Russia. He did not expect much of the American workers in the United States. The communists agreed the workers lacked the revolutionary spirit because they were spoiled by well-being and steeped in the vice of money-making. But Lenin did not no doubt that the European masses were class-conscious and therefore fully committed to revolutionary ideas. The only reason they were revolutionary had not been realized was the opinion of the inadequacy and cowardice of the communist officials. And again, he deposed his vicars and appointed new men, but he did not succeed any better. In the Anglo-Saxon and in the Latin American countries, the socialist voters placed confidence in democratic methods. Here, the number of people who seriously aim at a communist revolution is very small. Most of those who publicly proclaim their adherence to the principles of communism would feel extremely unhappy if the revolution were to arise and expose their lives and their property to danger. If the Russian armies are to march into their countries, or if a domestic communist were to seize power without engaging them in the fight, they were probably rejoining in the hope of being rewarded for their Marxian orthodoxy, but they themselves did not long for revolutionary laurels. It is a fact that in all of these 30 years of passionate pro-Soviet agitation, not a single country outside of Russia went communist of its own accord. Eastern Europe turned to a communism only when the diplomatic arrangements of international power politics had converted it into a sphere of exclusive Russian influence and hegemony. It is unlikely that Western Germany, France, Italy, and Spain will espouse communists if the United States and Great Britain do not adopt a policy of absolute diplomatic disinterestment. I'm not going to try the French. What gives strength to the communist movement in these and in some other countries is the disbelief that Russia is driven by an unflinching dynamism, which the Anglo-Saxon powers are indifferent and not very much interested in their fate. Marx and Marxians erred lamentably when they assumed that the masses long for a revolutionary overthrow of the bourgeois order of society. The militant communists are to be found only in the ranks of those who make a living from their communism or expect that a revolution would further their personal ambitions. The subversive activities of these professional plotters are dangerous precisely on account of the naivety of those who are merely flirting with revolutionary ideas. Those confused and misguided sympathizers who call themselves liberals and whom the communists call useful innocents, I don't think that's the word they used, useful innocents, the fellow travelers and even the majority of the officially registered party members would be terribly frightened if they were to discover how one day that their chiefs mean business when preaching sedition, but then it may be too late to avert disaster. For the time being, the ominous peril of the communist parties in the West lies in their stand on foreign affairs. The distinctive mark of all present-day communist parties is their devotion to the aggressive foreign policy of the Soviets. Whenever they must choose between Russia and their own country, they do not hesitate to prefer Russia. Their principle is, right or wrong, my Russia. They strictly obey all orders issued from Moscow. When Russia was an ally of Hitler, the French communists sabotaged their own country war effort, and the American communists passionately opposed President Roosevelt's plans to aid England and France in their struggle against the Nazis. The communists all over the world branded all those who defended themselves against German invaders as imperialist warmongers. But as soon as Hitler attacked Russia, the imperialist war of the capitalists changed overnight into a just war of defense. Whenever Stalin conquers one more country, the communists justify this aggression as an act of self-defense against fascists. In their blind worship of everything that is Russian, the communists of Western Europe and the United States by far surpass the worst excesses ever committed by chauvinists. They wax rapturous about Russia's movies, Russian music, and the alleged discoveries of Russian science. They speak in ecstatic words about the economic achievements of the Soviets. They ascribe the victory of the United Nations to the deeds of the Russian armed forces. Russia, they contend, has saved the world from the fascist menace. Russia is the only free country, while all other nations are subject to the dictatorship of the capitalists. The Russians alone are happy and enjoy the bliss of living a full life. In the capitalist countries, the immersed majority are suffering from the frustration and unfulfilled desires. Just as the pious Muslims yearns for a pilgrimage of the Prophet's tomb of Mecca, so the communist intellectual deems a pilgrimage of the holy shrines of Moscow as the event of his life. However, the distinction in the use of the terms communist and socialist did not affect the meaning of the terms communist and socialism as applied to the final goal of the policies common to them both. It was only in 1928 that the program of the Communist Internationale, adopted by the Sixth Congress in Moscow, began to differentiate between communism and socialism, and not merely between communism and socialists. According to this new doctrine, there is in the economic revolution of mankind, between the historical stage of capitalism, that of communism, a third stage, namely that of socialism. Socialism is a socialist system based on public control of means of production and full management of all process production and distribution of the planning and central authority. In this regard, it is equal to communism, but it differs from communism insofar as there is no equity of the portions allotted to each individual for his own consumption. There is still wages paid to the comrades, and these wage rates are graduated according to the economic expediency as far as a central authority deems it necessary for securing the greatest possible output of productions. What Stalin calls socialism corresponds by and large to Marx's concept of the early phase of communism. Stalin reserves the term communism exclusively for what Marx called the higher phase of communism. Socialism, in the sense of that Stalin was lately used, the term is moving towards communism, but is in itself not yet communism. Socialism will turn into communism as soon as the increase in wealth to be expected from the operation of the socialist methods of production has raised the lower standard of living of the Russian masses to the higher standard which the distinguished holders of important offices enjoy in present-day Russia. The apologetical character of the new terminology practice is obvious. Stalin finds it necessary to explain the vast majority of his subjects, while their standard of living is extremely low, much lower than what was the masses of the capitalist countries, and even lower than that of the Russian proletarians in the days of the Tsarist rule. He wants to justify the fact that salaries and wages are unequal, that it is a small group of Soviet officials enjoys all the luxuries modern techniques can provide, but a second group, more numerous than the first one, but less numerous than the middle class in Imperial Russia, lives in the bourgeois style, while the masses, ragged and barefoot, subside in congested slums and poorly fed. He can no longer blame capitalism for this state of affairs, thus he was compelled to resort to the new ideology makeshift. Stalin's problem was the more burning was the Russian communists in the early days of their rule had passionately proclaimed income inequality as a principle to enforce from the first instant of the proletarians' seizure of power. Moreover, in the capitalist countries, the most powerful demagogic trick applied by the Russia-sponsored communist parties is to excite the envy of those with lower incomes against all those with higher incomes. The main argument advanced by the communists for the support of their thesis that Hitler's National Socialism was not genuine socialism, but, on the contrary, the worst variety of capitalism, was that there was in Nazi Germany inequality in the standard of living. Stalin's new distinction between socialism and communism is one in contradiction to the policy of Lenin, and no less the tenet of the propaganda of the communist parties outside of the Russian frontiers. But such contradictions do not matter in the realm of the Soviets. The word for the dictator is the ultimate decision, and nobody is so foolhardy as to venture opposition. It is important to realize that Stalin's semantical innovations affects merely the term communism and socialism. He did not alter the meaning of the terms socialist and communist. The Bolshevist Party is just as before called communist. The Russophile parties beyond the borders of the Soviet Union call themselves communist parties and the violently fighting the socialist parties, which in their eyes are simply social traitors. But the official name of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics remains unchanged. Until 1992 at least anyway, when it became the Russian Federation. Okay, that's my reading today of Chapter 3. I really enjoy reading some of this older book. Von Mises was alive during all that transition, and he viewed it from an economic point of view. And so he has a lot of insight. I've always learned that Marxism thought socialism was a step, and it sort of seems that way, but in reality, Marxism and thought socialism and communism were the same thing. They were just different words. It was Stalin who brought in this separation between the two. And that to me is fascinating. And it makes me wonder about the people we have today who keep wanting to be interventionists in capitalism. I'll be writing a little bit about this later today on my gregorh.substack.com. Because I'm finding it amazing how capitalism, at least in Mises' eyes, and I'm beginning to lend credence to that, is really a natural state of affairs. It is sort of like capitalism is the, shall we say, non-GMO or organic method of doing business, where every time, as soon as you insert something like some government forced control or forced change, it's no longer organic, it's no longer non-GMO, it's something completely different. And it's just even anything you do at all to force its direction. is going to end badly, because capitalism is just going to always thrive. Even during the Soviet Union, the black market was thriving. Everybody knew it. Everybody knew how to get to it. And that's the most natural form of capitalism. That, it always crops up. When it's illegal, it becomes black market, but it's still capitalism. It may or may not be right. That's up to you. But as for me, I'm starting to realize how far we've strayed from capitalism, or true capitalism. And I'm trying to identify when we strayed. And I really think the founding fathers believed in the free market. Yet, it seems that as early as the early 1800s, there was moves towards the regulation and the restriction and the alteration of a free market. And I'm wondering how powerful every country could be if they would just allow a free market and allow people to do what they desire and serve the rest of society however they can in order to make a living. It would be quite interesting. Well, that is the reading for today. Thank you all for coming. And unless there's a phone call or something, I am going to call this a day, because, after 35 minutes, my voice is tired. Thank you, Charlie, for showing up, and, share with your friends. This is really, the whole goal here is to read the book so people have an opportunity to listen to it. It's called Planned Cahos by Ludwig Von Mises. This was chapter 3. Next week at 1 o'clock, we'll do chapter 4. I think just chapter 4, yeah. Pretty soon, there's a couple of chapters that are very short. I'm going to do them both together. But next week, chapter 4. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us at the Liberty Mindset. Freedom is a state of being, and liberty is a state of mind. So stay curious and seek the truth.